Billionaire's son failed every test, until a poor black girl instructed him to start from scratch. The grandfather clock in the Sterling mansion chimed exactly 4 o'clock, and 8-year-old Brandon's stomach twisted into a familiar knot. It was testing time again. "Brandon Sterling!" His father's voice boomed through the marble hallway, echoing off walls lined with golden-framed portraits of successful Sterling men. Each face seemed to stare down at Brandon with disappointment already etched in their painted eyes. "Study room. Now!" Brandon's small feet barely made a sound on the polished floor as he walked the seemingly endless corridor toward what he privately called the torture chamber. The Sterling mansion had 43 rooms, but this one, with its mahogany desk, leather-bound books, and the smell of old money, felt like the smallest space in the world when his father was testing him. Mr. Richard Sterling stood behind the imposing desk, his silver tie perfectly straight, his jaw set in that hard line Brandon knew meant business. At 45, he looked exactly like the oil painting of great-grandfather Sterling that hung above the fireplace, stern, successful, and completely intolerant of failure. "Sit." Mr. Sterling pointed to the small chair across from him. "Today we're reviewing the multiplication tables, followed by spelling words your great-grandfather mastered when he was 7. 7, Brandon? You're already a year behind the Sterling standard." Brandon slumped into the chair, his legs dangling above the floor. The Sterling standard. He'd heard that phrase so many times it felt like a heavy chain around his neck. Every Sterling man before him had been brilliant, had built empires, had made the family name mean something in this world. And then there was Brandon, the boy who couldn't even remember that 7 times 8 equals 56. "Let's begin," Mr. Sterling said, pulling out a leather notebook filled with his grandfather's handwriting. "What is 6 times 9? Brandon's mind went blank. He could feel his father's eyes boring into him, could sense the disappointment building like storm clouds. 42? Incorrect. 6 times 9 is 54. A fact that should be automatic by now." Mr. Sterling made a sharp mark in his notebook. "Next. Spell achievement. ACH. Brandon started then stopped. The letters jumbled in his mind like alphabet soup. ACHEIVMENT? Another harsh mark in the notebook. Wrong. When your great-grandfather was your age, he could spell words twice that difficulty. He was reading Shakespeare while you struggle with basic vocabulary. The portrait of great-grandfather Sterling seemed to frown deeper. Brandon had heard the stories 1,000 times, how great-grandfather had started the family fortune with nothing but his brilliant mind, how grandfather had doubled it by age 30, how his own father had tripled it before Brandon was even born. Each generation of Sterling men had been smarter, faster, better than the last. And then there was Brandon. History question. Mr. Sterling continued, his voice growing colder with each wrong answer. Who was the 16th President of the United States? Brandon knew this one. He was sure he knew this one. George Washington? The sound of Mr. Sterling's pen scratching another X was like nails on a chalkboard. Abraham Lincoln, Brandon. Abraham Lincoln. This is elementary knowledge that any Sterling should possess instinctively. The testing continued for another torturous hour. Math problems that made Brandon's head spin. Spelling words that seemed to dance and rearrange themselves the moment he tried to write them down. Historical dates that blurred together in an incomprehensible mess. With each wrong answer, Mr. Sterling's face grew sterner, his marks more aggressive, his disappointment more palpable. Finally, Mr. Sterling closed the notebook with a sharp snap. 23 questions, Brandon. 23 questions, and you managed to answer exactly 4 correctly. 4. Brandon stared at his hands, wishing he could disappear into the expensive Persian rug beneath his feet. I tried, Dad. I really tried. Trying isn't enough. Mr. Sterling's voice exploded through the room. Do you think your great-grandfather built this empire by trying? Do you think the Sterling name means anything because we tried? Results, Brandon. Excellence. That's what this family stands for. He walked to the window that overlooked their perfectly manicured gardens, his hands clasped behind his back. Your tutors tell me you're the most difficult student they've ever encountered. Mrs. Henderson quit last week. Mr. Patterson says you're unteachable. That's 4 tutors in 6 months, Brandon. The weight of being called unteachable settled on Brandon's small shoulders like a lead blanket. He'd overheard the conversations between his father and the tutors, whispered words like slow and challenged, and perhaps he's just not Sterling material. I'm running out of options, Mr. Sterling continued, still facing the window. And more importantly, I'm running out of patience. The Sterling Legacy Assessment is in 6 weeks. Brandon's blood ran cold. The Sterling Legacy Assessment, the annual test that every Sterling man had passed at age 8 for over a century. It wasn't just any test, it was the test, administered in front of family members, business partners, and anyone important enough to be invited to witness the continuation of Sterling brilliance. If you failed the assessment, Mr. Sterling turned around, his eyes hard as diamonds. If you fail, I'm sending you to Blackwood Military Academy. Immediately. Blackwood. Brandon had seen pictures of that place. Gray buildings, boys in rigid uniforms, faces that looked like they'd forgotten how to smile. It was where rich families sent their problem children, the ones who didn't fit the family mold. But Dad, No excuses, Brandon. 6 weeks. Either you prove you're a Sterling, or you prove you're not. Mr. Sterling walked toward the door, then paused. Your great-grandfather was reciting Shakespeare at your age. Your grandfather had already learned 3 languages. I had mastered calculus concepts by 8. And you can't even spell achievement. The door closed with a final, devastating click, leaving Brandon alone in the study room that suddenly felt more like a prison cell. He looked up at the portrait of great-grandfather Sterling, whose painted eyes seemed to hold all the disappointment in the world. I'm sorry, Brandon whispered to the portrait. I'm trying to be like you. I really am. But the painted man didn't answer, and Brandon was left with the terrible silence of his own failure. That night, lying in his enormous bedroom that was bigger than most people's entire homes, Brandon stared at the ceiling and tried not to cry. He tried everything: flashcards, memory games, even staying up past midnight to practice multiplication tables. Nothing worked. The numbers and letters just wouldn't stick in his brain the way they were supposed to. Maybe his father was right. Maybe he really was the family's biggest embarrassment. Maybe he just wasn't Sterling material. The grandfather clock chimed midnight, and Brandon finally allowed himself to cry, quiet, desperate tears for a boy who wanted nothing more than to make his father proud but couldn't seem to get anything right. Tomorrow would bring another tutor, another test, another opportunity to fail. In 6 weeks, he would either prove he belonged to the Sterling legacy, or he would be shipped away to become someone else's problem. The weight of the family name had never felt heavier. 3 days later, Brandon sat in the music room with his newest tutor, Miss Carmichael, a sharp-faced woman who spoke in clipped sentences and carried a ruler she wasn't afraid to use. Absolutely unacceptable, she declared, slapping the ruler against the piano bench as Brandon stumbled through another spelling exercise. How can you possibly confuse receive with receive? The rule is simple: I before E except after C. Even a child should grasp this basic concept. Brandon's cheeks burned with shame. I'm sorry, Miss Carmichael. I thought. That's precisely the problem. You're not thinking at all. She gathered her materials with sharp, angry movements. I've taught children from the finest families for 20 years, and I've never encountered such stubborn incompetence. The music room door slammed behind her, leaving Brandon alone with the echo of her footsteps and the familiar sting of being called stupid in yet another creative way. Through the tall windows, he could see the Sterling family gardens, perfectly trimmed hedges, fountain sculptures, and not a single thing out of place. Everything was beautiful, orderly, and completely suffocating. Brandon glanced toward the hallway, listening for his father's heavy footsteps. Mr. Sterling would want a report from Miss Carmichael, and when he heard about today's disaster, there would be another lecture about family expectations and Sterling standards. Another reminder that Blackwood Military Academy was waiting for boys who couldn't measure up. But the house was quiet. His father was locked away in his office on an important conference call, and the staff was busy with afternoon duties. For the first time in weeks, no one was watching Brandon, testing him, or demanding he prove his worth. The realization hit him like a lightning bolt: he could leave. Without stopping to think about consequences, Brandon slipped out the side door and began walking. The Sterling mansion sat on 5 acres of manicured property, but beyond the iron gates lay a world Brandon had barely seen. His father's driver usually took him everywhere in the black Mercedes, windows tinted, world shut out. But now, walking on his own 2 feet, Brandon felt something he hadn't experienced in months: freedom. He wandered through unfamiliar neighborhoods where houses were smaller but somehow felt warmer. Children played in front yards without uniformed nannies hovering nearby. Dogs barked from behind chain-link fences instead of professionally landscaped gardens. Everything was different, real in a way his world had never been. After walking for nearly an hour, Brandon found himself standing in front of a small, brick building with a faded sign that read, "Riverside Public Library." It looked nothing like the Sterling family's private library with its leather-bound first editions and climate-controlled atmosphere. This place looked ordinary. Maybe even a little run-down. Perfect. Brandon pushed through the heavy glass door and immediately noticed the difference. Where his family's library smelled of expensive leather and furniture polish, this place smelled like old paper and coffee. Instead of silence broken only by the tick of antique clocks, he heard the quiet murmur of conversations and the rustle of turning pages. "Can I help you, honey?" asked a kind-faced woman behind the front desk. She looked at Brandon's expensive clothes with curiosity but no judgment. "I'm just looking around," Brandon mumbled, suddenly feeling overdressed in his pressed khakis and polo shirt that probably cost more than most people spent on groceries. "Well, the children's section is right over there." She pointed toward a corner filled with colorful posters and small tables. "Make yourself at home." Brandon had never been in a children's section that wasn't part of his private tutoring. This one was different: books with worn covers that had obviously been read many times, beanbag chairs that looked comfortable instead of decorative, and artwork created by real kids taped to the walls instead of expensive paintings by deceased artists. He found an empty corner behind a tall bookshelf and sat on the carpet, grateful to be somewhere no one knew his name or expected him to perform. For the first time in weeks, his shoulders relaxed. That's when he heard her. "No, no, no! You can't just memorize it without understanding it." The voice was young but confident, with an edge of impatience that reminded Brandon of his tutors, except this voice wasn't mean, just determined. Curious despite himself, Brandon peeked around the bookshelf. At a small table covered with worn textbooks and notebook paper sat a girl about his age. Her dark skin glowed under the library's fluorescent lights, and her hair was pulled back into 2 neat braids. She wore a faded purple t-shirt and jeans that had obviously seen better days, but something about her posture screamed confidence in a way Brandon had never felt. She was bent over a piece of paper, scribbling with a stubby pencil that looked like it had been sharpened down to almost nothing. Around her were spread several books, math workbooks, a dictionary with a cracked spine, and what looked like handmade flashcards. "See if you just learn that 8 times 7 is 56 without knowing why," she continued, apparently talking to herself. "Then you'll forget it tomorrow. But if you understand that 8 times 7 is really just 7 plus 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 7. She counted on her fingers as she said each number. "Then your brain has something to hold on to." Brandon stared. This girl was teaching herself multiplication the same way his tutors had been trying to teach him for months. But she was making it make sense in a way no one ever had. "You gonna keep staring, or are you gonna say something?" the girl asked without looking up from her paper. Brandon's face went hot. I wasn't." "Yes, you were." Now she did look up, and Brandon saw the most intelligent brown eyes he'd ever encountered. "I've been watching your reflection in that computer screen for 5 minutes. You look like you've never seen someone do homework before." "I have too seen people do homework," Brandon protested, though he realized she was right. He never actually watched someone learn something because they wanted to, rather than because they had to. The girl set down her stubby pencil and really looked at him for the first time. Her gaze took in his expensive clothes, his perfect haircut, his shoes that probably cost more than her family's monthly rent. But instead of being impressed or intimidated, she just looked curious. "You're not from around here," she said. It wasn't a question. "No," Brandon admitted, suddenly feeling ashamed of his obvious wealth. "I'm just hiding." "Hiding from what?" Brandon hesitated. How could he explain that he was hiding from a legacy he couldn't live up to, from a father who saw him as a disappointment, from a future that seemed to involve either impossible success or exile to military school? "From being stupid," he finally whispered. The girl's expression softened slightly, but she didn't offer empty reassurance like adults always did. Instead, she asked, "What makes you think you're stupid?" And for the first time in his 8 years of life, Brandon found someone who actually seemed to want to know the answer. "Well?" The girl tapped her stubby pencil against the table, waiting. "You gonna answer, or just stand there looking like a deer in headlights?" Brandon stepped closer to her table, clutching his expensive leather backpack like a shield. "I fail every test. Every single one. My tutors say I'm unteachable, and my father says I'm the family's biggest embarrassment." She studied him with those sharp brown eyes. "What's your name?" "Brandon." "I'm Naomi." She gestured to the empty chair across from her. "Sit down, Brandon. Let me see what we're working with here." Brandon hesitated. At home, sitting down meant preparing for another round of failure and disappointment. But something about Naomi's direct manner, no fake smile, no condescending tone, made him trust her enough to sit. "Okay, Brandon," Naomi said, pulling out a fresh sheet of paper. "Let's start simple. Write your full name for me." "That's easy," Brandon said, relieved to finally get an easy question. He took the pencil she offered and carefully wrote, "Brandon Sterling." Naomi glanced at the paper and snorted. "You just spelled your own last name wrong." Brandon's face went hot. "What?" "No, I didn't. Sterling has a G at the end, doesn't it? Unless your family changed their name to Sterling when you weren't looking." Brandon stared at the paper in horror. She was right. He'd misspelled his own name, the name that was carved in marble above his front door, printed on business cards throughout the house, painted in gold letters on family portraits. "Oh my God!" he whispered. "I can't even spell my own name right." "Relax," Naomi said, but not unkindly. "It's just a mistake. Let's try something else. What's 4 times 3? 12, Brandon answered quickly, proud to no one. "Good. Now what's 6 times 7? Brandon's mind went blank. He could picture his father's disappointed face, could hear Miss Carmichael's sharp voice telling him it should be automatic. 48? Nope. 42. Naomi wrote the correct answer down. "How about spelling friend?" Friend. Brandon spelled carefully. Naomi shook her head and wrote the correct spelling underneath his attempt. "What about because?" BCUS. "You're missing the at the end." She added it to the paper. "Okay, one more. Who was the first president? Abraham Lincoln?" Brandon guessed hopefully. Naomi stared at him for a long moment, then set down her pencil. "Brandon, honey, you don't even know your basics." The words hit him like a physical blow. "I know. I'm stupid. That's what everyone says." "No," Naomi said firmly. "You're not stupid. But you're trying to build a house without a foundation. Your fancy tutors are probably trying to teach you algebra when you haven't mastered addition. They're giving you Shakespeare when you're still figuring out simple sentences." She leaned back in her chair, studying him with a mixture of sympathy and determination. "Let me guess. They make you memorize multiplication tables without explaining what multiplication actually means. They give you spelling lists without teaching you the patterns. They expect you to know history dates without helping you understand why those events mattered." Brandon's mouth fell open. "How did you know that?" "Because that's exactly backwards from how learning actually works," Naomi said. It's like trying to read a book starting from the middle. Of course you're confused. She gathered up her books and stood up. Come on. Where are we going? To fix this mess. Naomi led him to a quiet corner of the children's section where she spread her materials on a larger table. But I'm warning you right now, I don't do things the fancy way. No expensive workbooks, no computer programs, no sugarcoating. We're going back to basics. What do you mean, basics? Naomi pulled out a sheet of construction paper and some crayons from her backpack. I mean, we're starting from scratch. The very beginning. The ABCs. Brandon recoiled as if she'd suggested he wear diapers. The ABCs? I'm 8 years old. I'm not a baby. Really? Naomi challenged. Then why did you spell friend with an I? Why don't you know that George Washington was the first president? If you really knew your ABCs, you'd know the patterns that make spelling easier. Brandon's pride warred with his desperation. At home, admitting he needed to start over would be like confessing he was hopeless. But here, with this confident girl who didn't seem to think he was broken. Fine, he mumbled. But if anyone sees me doing baby work, nobody's watching except me, and I don't care what grade level we start at. I care about what works. Naomi uncapped a red crayon. Now we're going to learn the alphabet, but not the boring way. We're going to make it stick. She began drawing large, colorful letters across the construction paper. A is for apple, but also for angry and awesome. Feel that a sound in your mouth when you say those words. As she spoke, she exaggerated the sound, making Brandon feel the way his mouth moved. Now you try. Give me 3 more words, but really feel that sound. And? And amazing? Brandon found himself leaning forward, caught up despite himself. And airplane? Perfect. You felt it, didn't you? That's how your mouth moves for the sound. She moved to the letter B. Now B is different. It's a popping sound. Ball bounce, brother. Feel how your lips come together and then pop apart? For the next hour, they worked through the alphabet in a way Brandon had never experienced. Instead of just reciting letters, Naomi made him understand them, how they felt in his mouth, how they connected to make words, how patterns worked. When they got to simple math, she didn't just make him memorize that 2 plus 2 is equal to 4. She gave him 4 crayons and had him physically group them, then regroup them, until he could see what addition actually meant. You see? Naomi said as Brandon successfully solved 3 plus 5 by counting on his fingers without shame. Your brain just needed to understand what numbers actually are, not just memorize answers. Brandon stared at his hands, amazed. For the first time in his life, math made sense. Not because someone had drilled it into him, but because someone had shown him what it meant. Why didn't my tutors teach me this way? He asked. Naomi shrugged. Probably because they're used to kids who already have the foundation. They skipped the ground floor and went straight to the fancy stuff. She started packing up her materials. But we're going to build you up properly. From the ground up. We? Brandon's heart jumped. You mean, you'll help me again? Same time tomorrow, Naomi said matter-of-factly. But I'm warning you, this isn't going to be easy, and it's not going to be fast. We've got a lot of catching up to do. As Brandon walked home that evening, he felt something he hadn't experienced in months. Hope. Maybe he really could learn. Maybe he wasn't broken after all. Maybe he just needed someone who understood that sometimes you have to start from scratch. 2 weeks into their secret library sessions, Brandon discovered that Naomi's lessons extended far beyond multiplication tables and spelling patterns. Here, she said one afternoon, pulling a crumpled brown paper bag from her backpack. I brought extra. Brandon peered into the bag and saw a slightly smashed peanut butter sandwich, an apple with a small bruise, and a handful of crackers. At home, his meals were prepared by a professional chef and served on china that cost more than most people's cars. This simple lunch looked foreign to him. I'm not really hungry, he lied, though his stomach had been growling for an hour. Naomi gave him one of her signature no-nonsense looks. Brandon, When someone offers to share their food with you, you say thank you, not I'm not hungry. That's just good manners. But I can buy my own food, Brandon protested. I have money. This isn't about money, dummy. Naomi tore her sandwich in half and pushed one piece toward him. It's about sharing. Friends share with each other, even when they don't have much to share. The word friends hit Brandon like a warm wave. He'd had playmates, carefully selected children of his father's business associates who came to supervise playdates at the mansion. But he never had a friend who chose to spend time with him just because she wanted to. He took a bite of the sandwich. It was simple, nothing fancy, but it tasted better than any meal he could remember. Thank you, he said quietly. See? That wasn't so hard. Naomi grinned and opened her math workbook. Now let's work on those multiplication facts. But this time, we're going to do it differently. Instead of drilling him at a table, Naomi took him to the children's reading area where a group of younger kids were struggling with picture books. See that little girl over there? She pointed to a 6-year-old who was frowning at a book about counting. Go help her. What? I can't teach someone else math. I barely know it myself. That's exactly why you should teach it, Naomi said firmly. When you explain something to someone else, it sticks in your own brain better. Trust me. Reluctantly, Brandon approached the little girl. Hi. I'm Brandon. Are you having trouble with your counting book? The girl looked up with big, frustrated eyes. I can't figure out why 3 plus 2 makes 5. It doesn't make sense. Brandon felt a flash of recognition, that same confusion he'd felt for years. But now, thanks to Naomi's teaching, he actually understood what the numbers meant. Here, he said, sitting down beside her. Let me show you with your fingers. Hold up 3 fingers, now hold up 2 more. See? Count them all together, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That's why 3 plus 2 makes 5. The girl's face lit up with understanding. Oh. So the numbers are just counting how many things you have. Exactly. Brandon felt a surge of pride and excitement he'd never experienced before. Want to try another one? For the next 20 minutes, Brandon helped the little girl work through her counting book, and with each problem he explained, his own understanding grew stronger. When they finished, the girl hugged him and ran to show her mother what she'd learned. How did that feel? Naomi asked when he returned to their table. Amazing, Brandon admitted. She actually understood what I was telling her. I've never been able to help someone learn something before. That's because you finally understand it yourself, Naomi said. Real learning isn't just memorizing answers, it's understanding something so well you can teach it to someone else. Their daily sessions began to follow a pattern. Naomi would teach Brandon a concept using her hands-on methods, then they would find younger children in the library who needed help with similar problems. Brandon discovered that explaining long division to a 7-year-old helped him master it himself. Teaching a 5-year-old how to sound out words made his own reading more confident. But the academic lessons were only part of what Brandon was learning. Why do you always help the librarian put books away? He asked one day as Naomi gathered picture books from the reading area. Because Mrs. Rodriguez works hard, and she's nice to us, Naomi replied, shelving books as she talked. When someone's good to you, you should be good back. Besides, this library doesn't have much money. Every little bit of help matters. Brandon had never thought about helping people who worked for his family. At home, there were maids and gardeners and drivers, but they were just there. It had never occurred to him that they might appreciate kindness or assistance. The next day, he surprised Naomi by arriving early and helping Mrs. Rodriguez organize the children's section before their lesson began. Look at you, being helpful. Naomi grinned when she found him carefully arranging books by size. Your mama raised you right. Actually, Brandon said quietly. You did. As the weeks passed, Brandon noticed changes in himself that went far beyond academics. When a younger boy dropped his crayons, Brandon automatically helped him pick them up. When an elderly woman struggled to reach a book on a high shelf, he asked Mrs. Rodriguez to help her. When Naomi mentioned that her pencil was getting too short to use comfortably, Brandon brought her a pack of new ones the next day, not to show off his money, but simply because friends helped each other. "You know what's different about you?" Naomi said one afternoon as they worked through a particularly challenging spelling lesson. "I'm getting better at school stuff?" "Well, yeah, that too. But mainly you stopped being afraid." Brandon looked up from his worksheet. "Afraid of what?" "Afraid of making mistakes. Afraid of looking stupid. Afraid of not being perfect." Naomi tapped her pencil thoughtfully against the table. "When I first met you, you acted like every wrong answer was the end of the world. Now you just fix it and keep going." She was right. Brandon realized that somewhere along the way, he'd stopped flinching every time he made an error. With Naomi, mistakes weren't catastrophes. They were just information about what he needed to work on next. "Why is it different here?" he asked. "At home, when I get something wrong, it feels like you're disappointing everyone?" "Yeah. Like I'm proving I don't belong in my family." Naomi was quiet for a moment, then said something that would stay with Brandon forever. "Maybe the problem isn't that you don't belong in your family. Maybe the problem is that your family forgot what belonging really means." That evening, as Brandon walked home through the darkening streets, he carried more than just academic confidence. He carried the knowledge that learning could be joyful, that mistakes could be stepping stones instead of roadblocks, and that true friendship meant someone believing in you even when you didn't believe in yourself. For the first time in his life, Brandon Sterling was excited about being tested, not because he was sure he'd get everything right, but because he finally understood that getting things right wasn't the point. The point was learning, growing, and never giving up. The point was starting from scratch and building something real. The morning of the Sterling Legacy Assessment arrived like a storm Brandon had been watching approach for weeks. He woke before dawn, his stomach churning with a mixture of nervousness and something he'd never felt before a test: quiet confidence. 6 weeks ago, he would have been paralyzed with terror. Today, he was scared, but it was a different kind of fear, the kind that came with caring about the outcome, not the kind that came from expecting to fail. "Brandon!" His father's voice boomed through the mansion. "Study room! Now!" But this time, Brandon walked down the marble hallway with his shoulders straight. The portraits of successful Sterling men no longer seemed to glare down at him with disappointment. Instead, he found himself wondering what they would think of Naomi's teaching methods, of learning that started from scratch and built something solid. The study room had been transformed for the occasion. Mr. Sterling stood behind his imposing desk, but he wasn't alone. Uncle Richard, Grandfather Sterling, and 3 of his father's business partners filled leather chairs around the room. They were all here to witness either Brandon's triumph or his final failure. "Gentlemen," Mr. Sterling announced formally, "today we determine whether Brandon Sterling is worthy of our family name. This assessment has been passed by every Sterling man for over a century. The questions cover mathematics, spelling, history, and general knowledge appropriate for a Sterling heir." Brandon took his seat at the small desk that had been positioned in the center of the room, feeling like a gladiator entering the arena. But instead of panic, he heard Naomi's voice in his head. "Remember, mistakes aren't the end of the world. They're just information about what to work on next. Let's begin," Mr. Sterling said, opening the leather-bound test booklet. "First question. What is 8 times 7? Brandon closed his eyes briefly, not to panic, but to use Naomi's method. He visualized 7 groups of 8 objects. The way she taught him multiplication was really just organized addition. 56, he said clearly. "Correct." Mr. Sterling made a mark in his book, unable to hide his surprise. "Next, spell achievement." Brandon thought about the word carefully, using Naomi's pattern recognition techniques. "achievement." Correct again. Now Uncle Richard leaned forward with interest. The questions continued: history dates, vocabulary words, math problems that would have destroyed Brandon's confidence just weeks ago. But thanks to Naomi's foundation-building approach, each answer came naturally. When he encountered something he wasn't sure about, he didn't panic. He thought it through step by step, the way she taught him. "Who was the 16th President of the United States?" Mr. Sterling asked. Abraham Lincoln, Brandon answered without hesitation. He was president during the Civil War and signed the Emancipation Proclamation. Grandfather Sterling nodded approvingly. The boy knows his history. But then came a question that made Brandon pause. Explain the economic principles that built the Sterling fortune. Brandon had memorized facts about railroads and steel investments for previous tests, but this time he thought about what the question really meant. He thought about Mrs. Rodriguez working hard at the library with limited resources, about Naomi sharing her lunch even when she didn't have much, about the difference between having money and understanding value. The Sterling fortune was built on identifying opportunities and working hard. Brandon began slowly. But I think the real principle should be using success to help others succeed too. Great-grandfather didn't just make money, he created jobs for people, built things that made communities stronger. The best economic principle isn't just getting wealthy, it's making sure your success lifts other people up with you. The room fell silent. This wasn't the kind of answer they'd expected from their memorization-focused questions. Uncle Richard spoke first. That's quite a mature perspective for an 8-year-old. Where did that insight come from? Mr. Sterling asked, his voice carefully neutral. Brandon hesitated. This was the moment he'd been dreading, when he'd have to admit that his success came not from expensive tutors or Sterling family methods, but from a 9-year-old girl in a public library. I learned it from my friend Naomi, he said finally. She taught me that real learning isn't just about memorizing answers. It's about understanding what things mean and how to help other people understand them too. Naomi? Mr. Sterling's eyebrows rose. Which tutor is that? I don't recall hiring anyone by that name. She's not a tutor, Brandon said, his voice growing stronger. She's a girl at the public library. She's 9 years old, and she's the best teacher I've ever had. The business partners exchanged glances. Uncle Richard cleared his throat uncomfortably. Richard, are you telling us that a public school child has been teaching your son? Brandon saw the disapproval in their faces and felt his old fear creeping back. But then he remembered Naomi's words. Friends believe in each other even when other people don't understand. Yes, he said firmly. And she's amazing. She taught me that I wasn't stupid, I just needed to start from the beginning and build up properly. She showed me that making mistakes is how you learn, not proof that you can't learn. And she taught me that the most important thing about knowing something is being able to help other people learn it too. Mr. Sterling stared at his son for a long moment. You're telling me that all this improvement comes from spending time with a child from the public library? Yes, sir. And you believe this unconventional education, has prepared you to carry on the Sterling legacy? Brandon thought about everything Naomi had taught him, not just math and spelling, but kindness, persistence, and the courage to help others. I think it's prepared me to create a better Sterling legacy. The room fell silent again, but this time the silence felt different. Charged. Electric. Mr. Sterling closed the test booklet. Brandon, you've answered every question correctly. For the first time in Sterling family history, someone has achieved a perfect score on the legacy assessment. The business partners began to murmur among themselves, but Brandon barely heard them. He'd done it. He'd actually done it. But more importantly, he'd done it as himself, not by trying to become someone else, but by learning to build on his own foundation. However, Mr. Sterling continued, his voice taking on that familiar stern tone. We need to discuss this irregular educational arrangement you've developed. Brandon's heart sank. Even in victory, it seemed his father couldn't accept that something good had come from outside their world of privilege and traditional methods. The showdown wasn't over yet. This irregular educational arrangement, Mr. Sterling continued, his voice carrying the weight of generations of family tradition, is completely unacceptable. A Sterling heir learning from some public library child? What will our associates think? What will this do to our family's reputation? Brandon felt his perfect test score suddenly mean nothing in the face of his father's disappointment. Uncle Richard nodded in agreement, and the business partners whispered among themselves with obvious disapproval. Richard's right. Uncle Richard said firmly. The boy may have passed the test, but the methods are unseemly. We can't have it said that sterling excellence comes from charity cases and public institutions. Naomi isn't a charity case, Brandon burst out, surprising everyone in the room, including himself. She's brilliant. She's kinder than anyone I know. And she's the reason I can finally think instead of just memorize. Brandon, that's enough, Mr. Sterling warned. You will not raise your voice in this room. But something had shifted inside Brandon during those weeks at the library. He'd learned that his voice mattered, that his thoughts had value, that standing up for what was right was more important than keeping everyone comfortable. No, Dad. It's not enough. Brandon stood up from his small desk, his 8-year-old frame suddenly seeming taller. I got a perfect score. Something no Sterling has ever done before. And you want to be mad about how I did it instead of celebrating that I did it? Grandfather Sterling, who had been quiet throughout the exchange, spoke up. The boy has a point, Richard. Results are what matter in business. But the methodology, Uncle Richard protested. The methodology worked, Brandon interrupted, his confidence growing. For the first time in my life, I actually understand what I'm learning instead of just parroting back answers. Naomi taught me that real intelligence isn't about memorizing fancy facts to impress people. It's about understanding things so well that you can help other people understand them too. He turned to face his father directly. You want to know what I learned from Naomi? I learned that being smart means being curious, not just being right. I learned that making mistakes is how you grow, not proof that you're worthless. And I learned that the best way to honor what you know is to share it with people who need help. Mr. Sterling's face was unreadable, but Brandon pressed on. Great-grandfather didn't build this fortune by only talking to rich people. He built it by understanding what regular people needed and finding ways to provide it. Naomi taught me more about real leadership in 6 weeks than all my expensive tutors taught me in 6 years. You're 8 years old, one of the business partners said dismissively. What could you possibly know about leadership? Brandon turned to him with the same steady confidence Naomi had always shown. I know that yesterday I helped a 6-year-old learn to read because someone took the time to help me. I know that sharing what you have makes everyone stronger. And I know that the smartest person in any room is usually the one asking questions, not the one pretending to have all the answers. The room fell silent. Brandon could see his father processing his words, weighing them against years of Sterling tradition and social expectations. Finally, Grandfather Sterling spoke again. In my day, we believed that excellence was excellence, regardless of where it came from. This boy has achieved something none of us ever did. Maybe we should be asking how we can learn from his methods instead of criticizing them. You want me to invite some public school child into our home? Mr. Sterling asked incredulously. I want you to invite my friend, Brandon said simply. The person who believed in me when everyone else had given up. The person who taught me that being a Sterling should mean lifting other people up, not looking down on them. He walked to the window that overlooked their manicured gardens, then turned back to face the room full of adults. I have an idea. What if we didn't just invite Naomi? What if we invited lots of kids from the library? Kids who are smart but don't have access to expensive tutors? What if the Sterling legacy became about sharing knowledge instead of hoarding it? Uncle Richard scoffed. Turn our home into some kind of tutoring center for the masses? Turn our home into a place where we use our advantages to help others succeed, Brandon corrected. Isn't that what great-grandfather would have wanted? To create something that made the whole community stronger? Mr. Sterling was quiet for a long moment, staring at his son as if seeing him for the first time. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer than Brandon had heard it in months. You really believe this girl, Naomi, is the reason for your success? I know she is, Brandon said without hesitation. And I believe she could help other kids the way she helped me. We have 43 rooms in this house, Dad. What if we use some of them to give kids like me, kids who learn differently, a chance to discover they're not broken? The business partners exchanged uncertain glances, but Grandfather Sterling was nodding slowly. The boys thinking like a true Sterling, identifying opportunities and finding ways to create value for others. Mr. Sterling walked to the window and stood beside his son, looking out at their vast estate. You understand this would be unconventional? The best ideas usually are, Brandon replied, echoing something Naomi had told him. After another long silence, Mr. Sterling turned to face the room. Gentlemen, I believe my son has just redefined what it means to carry on the Sterling legacy. 3 months later, the Sterling mansion hosted its first foundation learning session. 15 children from the local library, including Naomi, gathered in what had once been a formal sitting room that no one ever used. Brandon watched with pride as Naomi taught a struggling 7-year-old the same multiplication techniques that had transformed his own understanding. You did good, Brandon, Naomi said as they packed up materials at the end of the session. This is what real legacy looks like. Brandon grinned, watching younger children discover that they weren't stupid, just in need of a different approach. I learned from the best teacher I know. As the sun set over the Sterling estate, Brandon realized that he had finally lived up to his family name, not by memorizing facts or impressing adults, but by understanding that true wealth meant using what you had to help others discover what they could become. The Sterling legacy would never be the same. And that was exactly as it should be.